Way back in 1801, a little boy named Hiram Smith was attending the funeral of his grandfather here in the Rocky Hills of Chester, Massachusetts. For days leading up to that funeral, rain had been pouring down over Chester, buckets and buckets, unrelenting. And now, on the day that the coffin was set to be lowered into the earth, Grandpa Smith's grave was all full of water. The gravediggers did their best to bail it out, but it was no use. Even on the day of the funeral, it was still pouring rain, and the grave was just filling right back up as quick as they could empty it out. So, the gravediggers sat, and they thought about the problem for a while, and ultimately decided that no, they're not just going to take the body back somewhere else and wait for it to stop raining. No, they did all the work of getting it here. That coffin is going into the earth today. And so, they floated the coffin there in the dark, watery grave and began to pile rock after rock upon the lid. And little by little, the weight began to push Grandpa Smith deeper and deeper into the mud until finally it disappeared from the view of little Hiram Smith, swallowed by the muck right in front of him. Now, despite the fact that he was just a kid, Hiram was deeply struck by that sight. The arc of his life had just been changed forever. He raised his face up towards the sky, felt the rain prance down his skin, and swore to those around him, to the world, that he would never be buried in a mud hole. And he stuck to that promise too. Because this just wasn't like some knee-jerk reaction of a child. No, this was something real. Hiram Smith spent the next 45 years of his life searching for some way, somehow, some place that he could be laid to rest without having to be buried in the dirt. As he put it, he didn't want mud on his bones. His life's work became to find a good, dry place for them. And after almost a half century of searching, he found it. Let me show you. The engravings are definitely a little bit tough to read nowadays, but this is the tomb of Hiram Smith. Just a rock out in the woods with a hole cut into it. Pretty crazy to know that there's a body in there, right? Actually, two bodies. Hiram's sister, Isabella, is in there too. Hiram actually had her body exhumed and reburied with him here on the rock, despite the fact that she had already been dead for 4 years when Hiram finally passed away. Pretty crazy, right? I mean, how often do you just stumble upon a big boulder in the woods with two bodies inside of it? And this thing is not exactly easy to find either. Like, it's a good ways from any paved road, and there's no like real established named hiking trail leading to it, and it's miles and miles away from any other grave. It's just like alone out here in the snow and trees, mostly forgotten to history, which is why I want to add a little color to its story. You see, most modern accounts of Hiram and his tomb are pretty sparse. They're usually not longer than a paragraph or so, and they typically include some kind of line like, no one knows where Hiram's fear of the ground came from, and just generally, there's not really a lot of contemporary talk out there on some of the finer details surrounding Hiram's story. So what I'm going to do here is fill you in on those details, including one pretty shocking little tidbit I was able to dig up that, as far as I can tell, nobody talks about anymore. Something that kind of changes the whole complexion of the Hiram Smith story. But hey, before we get there, how about we talk a little bit about the boulder itself? This big old rock here is what's known as a glacial erratic, a very special kind of boulder that we've actually talked about a few times on this channel. Basically, all it is a big rock that was, at one point in history, picked up by a giant glacier thousands of years ago, drug along with the glacier for miles and miles, and then dumped here as the glacier eventually melted or retreated, which is pretty cool on its own, right? It's just that Hiram came along to make it even cooler. And through a pretty intensive process too. Like actually carving the tomb into this rock was not easy. Hiram had work started on the boulder here like way back in 1868, 5 years before he would eventually pass away. Like he knew that this was gonna be a big job and he wanted to make sure that it would be ready and waiting for him. The first stoneworker that he employed for the job was a Scottish man named John Gristy, who promptly blew off 2 of his fingers trying to blast the cavity into the rock with some explosives. So Hiram turned next to a whole team of experienced stoneworkers who spent the next 10 straight weeks drilling a hole large enough for 2 bodies. Apparently the whole thing cost over $1,000 back then, which would be roughly equivalent to like 20 grand today. Like pretty expensive, right? The tomb also might have at one point either had a steel or a marble door on it, but I really can't be sure. Like there was a lot of conflicting reports shooting around the country back when word of the tomb here was first starting to spread, and sometimes they just like were reporting blatantly wrong information. Like I even found this one article from way over in Ohio saying that the boulder was over 80 feet long, which clearly is not the case. And the newspapers back then weren't just concerned with the tomb either. Like no, there was a good amount of examination of Hiram himself. Like for example, a lot of the newspapers did interviews with other residents of Chester, which tended to reveal just how completely dedicated Hiram was to his anti-burial thing. Like it really sounded like it was just a feature of the community here that this old farmer guy would always be telling anyone who would listen that he never wants to be buried and that he wants to keep his bones dry and, you know, all that other stuff. Apparently it was just such a like normal thing that all these people heard for years that when Hiram like eventually followed through on the promise, it was like kind of a shock. Like, whoa, oh my God, Hiram's actually doing it. I can't believe it. Hiram was definitely a bit of an eccentric outside of just the burial thing too, though. Like for some reason, he had an extreme fear of milking cows, and he also refused to use any modern farming equipment, like at all, preferring instead to stick to the exact same set of tools that his father used before him. And, you know, with all these like odd little tendencies piling up, you might think that Hiram was some kind of like outcast in Chester, but no, he was just as accepted as anyone else. In fact, by all accounts, Hiram loved to host visitors. He would always make sure to have like big pots of rum and cider and barrels of apples sitting around his house, ready to pass them out to any neighbors who would come a-calling. So he seems like a nice guy, right? Although, at the same time, you better make sure not to cross old Hiram either. Betray his trust and he will never forget it. Hiram Smith was a friendly man, but apparently not a forgiving one. Just another piece of the fascinating puzzle that is Hiram Smith. But you know what? Hiram wasn't exactly Chester's lone eccentric either. No, in fact, it really seems like the entire Smith clan had some unique perspectives on the concept of burial. You see, Hiram spent most of his life living with his sister, Isabella, and his mother, who most people in the town just called Aunt Betty. And Hiram mostly took care of his sister and mother. You know, he did all the farm work, worked out in the fields, took care of the animals, with the exception of milking the cow because, again, he was scared of milking cows. But the bottom line is Hiram Smith spent most of his time in the day out working the farm until the sun went down. And then the Smith family would engage in their favorite activity, what they truly loved to do, which was light a fire late on a cold winter's night and then sit up and chat for hours about burial practices. Yep, the whole Smith family was real concerned about what was going to happen to their earthly bodies. Like, you know how Hiram's sister, Isabella, was dug up and reburied in the rock here years after she had passed away? Well, there's a good chance that that wasn't just Hiram making that decision on his own. No, like, I actually found a few sources claiming that Isabella, for whatever reason, also had some kind of fear of the earth. But even stranger than that was the request that Hiram's mother, Betty, left upon her death. Led by some kind of like superstition, Betty thought that when somebody dies, it's bad luck to bury them right away. So, on her deathbed, she made Hiram promise not to bury her for a while. And Hiram agreed and just stuck her body in the house's parlor for 4 months. Just casket right there in the middle of the room. And apparently the Smiths' neighbors were really not too happy about that. They complained about it all the time, and whenever they had to walk or ride by the Smith house, they would literally cross the street and hug the far side of the road so they could stay as far away as possible from the house and casket. But I guess the Smith family themselves, they kind of loved Aunt Betty's example, because when Hiram's sister-in-law was dying, she asked for the exact same thing to be done to her body. And so Hiram's brother just stuck the coffin in the barn for a couple of months before burying it. Pretty wild, right? I mean, Hiram Smith is just one of those people that you gotta be glad existed in this world. And you know, I am far from the only one in history to be thinking that too. Like, I found a ton of articles all through the last century and a half, like journalists all talking about how they had heard tell of some weird little rock tomb deep in the woods and how they spent hours hacking through the undergrowth, walking in circles, desperately trying to find Hiram's hidden resting place. Like, for example, here's a guy from 1891 who literally searched for the tomb until the sun went down, going up and down every hill, wading through bogs, searching every bush, until finally stumbling upon the boulder in the evening golden hour. And here's another guy in 1957 trying his best to find the tomb with the only direction being that it's near a birch tree with the words, "I love you," carved into it. And this one's probably my favorite. A journalist from 1931 who really needed some energy for tomb hunting. So for breakfast, he had 14 pancakes, 4 eggs, some fruit, 6 strips of bacon, just the right kind of bacon, by the way, a slice of cake, some fried potatoes, a cup of coffee, and some milk. You gotta fuel up before you hit the woods, right? Sadly, though, not all trips to Hiram's tomb were done out of curiosity and respect for the dead. Poor Isabella and Hiram have dealt with a whole lot of attempted grave robbing over the years. Like, it pretty much never happens anymore, but for a short period right after the tomb had been sealed, it was not uncommon for people to come up here and try to break into the boulder. Like, apparently it used to be a common misconception that Hiram had been buried with a whole bunch of expensive jewelry for some reason, but as one resident of Chester puts it, all that's in there now is bones and dust. One pretty interesting thing that we can glean from all these historic trips to the tomb, though, is just how difficult it used to be to actually find the thing. You know, if you weren't from around here, then locating and hiking to the boulder was like a day-long endeavor filled with like hour after hour of bushwhacking. And hey, even today, it's not exactly easy to find. Like, I found it because I had good directions, but there's basically no chance whatsoever that anybody would ever like just randomly stumble upon this thing without setting out to deliberately look for it, right? Which is kind of a shame, because that is pretty much the exact opposite of what Hiram wanted. You see, Hiram was the last of his household to pass away. Both his mother and sister had been dead for years, so without anyone to leave the money to, Hiram stipulated in his will that he wanted pretty much the entirety of his estate to go towards building and maintaining a little road that would snake on through the hills, leading right on up to his tomb. That way, anyone and everyone could go see it without too much trouble, which I'm sure would have been something that most of the residents of Chester would have really appreciated, because after all, from what I've read, his funeral up on the hillside had apparently been really moving for the rest of the townsfolk. Like, I found plenty of newspaper articles from years after Hiram's death, all talking about how pretty much the whole town still fondly remembers the day that they were all huddled up on the hillside, reminiscing about the last of one of the oddest families that their little community had ever seen. So it makes sense that they would like to go up and see the tomb again, right? So, why is there no road? I mean, Hiram wanted it, and the townsfolk probably would have liked it, but it's just not here. Why? Well, the reason is pretty startling. Apparently, the trustee of Hiram's estate, the man who was in charge of getting that road built and maintained, just smuggled the money away for his own use instead. Yep, Hiram's road fund was stolen from him. A little bit sad, huh? I mean, Hiram was expecting a nice, pretty little path leading admirers right on up to visit him, and instead he got years and years of newspapers and books printing stuff like "The Seeker must go on foot through briar, brush, and swamp to reach this unique mausoleum." But you know what? It gets even worse. As if one complete violation of Hiram's wishes wasn't enough, I actually found one more pretty wild little detail regarding Hiram's story. See, Hiram Smith died in the winter on February 21st, 1873, during a time of year when there was a whole bunch of snow surrounding the tomb. Probably looked a whole lot like it does today. And so, rather than clear the snow away from the rock, those in charge of Hiram's body decided to risk his displeasure and bury him in the earth for the next few months. Yeah, Hiram Smith spent several months stuck in the ground, something that he spent his whole life trying to avoid, until May rolled around and they dug him up and hauled him up to his boulder. I mean, that has got to be disappointing, right? I mean, I know eventually he ended up in his tomb here, but still, there is no way that Hiram would have been fine with being stuck in the ground for 3 months. Like, remember, his promise as a young boy was that he would never be buried in the ground, ever. And remember, too, that Hiram Smith is a man that does not forgive. He does not forget. He knows how to hold a grudge. Like, this is a man that is singularly devoted to just one thing his entire life, and he is deprived of it at just the very last moment. Like, right before he was set to spend eternity in his boulder, he is blindsided with a surprise burial, and the one thing he spent his life trying to avoid is forced upon him anyway, against his will. The thing he wanted most ripped away. But you know, if you really think about it, that doesn't have to be the end of Hiram's story. Like, we don't have to end this video all depressed about the fact that Hiram didn't get either of the two things he wanted most. No, because if you ask me, I really think there was one more thing that Hiram Smith probably wanted in life and in death. A desire that can still be fulfilled today. I think Hiram Smith might have just wanted to be appreciated. I mean, think about it. He's a great host who loves to pass around rum and apples, and he takes excellent care of his family. He dutifully honors the last request of his mother, and at the end of his life, he makes it very clear how important it is to him that people come and visit. I mean, why else would he want that road, right? Like, Hiram's got a unique relic of history here, and it makes sense that he would want people to see it. An inviting road, a clear path to the boulder, like, those things would all but guarantee that people would still come out here and remember Hiram Smith, to appreciate the wonderful mark that he left for us on this planet. And you know what? Even that first story that I told you, the genesis of Hiram's fear of burial, the sight of watching his grandfather sink slowly into the mud, to a child, that cannot look like someone being appreciated, can it? Like, maybe that was Hiram's first real experience with death. Like, maybe that was the first time he ever saw a coffin lowered into the earth. Maybe in his mind, this couldn't possibly be the way that you truly honor someone's life. I don't know. But then at the same time, like, maybe I'm off the mark, right? Like, maybe I'm just making stuff up. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm looking for a silver lining, or a hidden meaning, some kind of ethereal message that just isn't there, right? Like, maybe Hiram doesn't actually care if we appreciate him or not. But it's probably not gonna hurt to do it anyway, right? Thanks for watching.